never fear. It is only picking up those of us who are unmuted and speaking into the little yellow box. So as long as you stay muted, you will not be in the recording. Apropos of that, please use the chat box throughout the evening if you have any questions for our authors. You can put your questions into the chat and we will save them up for you, and Davith and I will ask them for you at the end of the night. And then last of all, before we introduce our authors, just a quick thank you to all of you for your ongoing support of independent bookstores and independent book selling. It's been a rough year and we're really grateful for the ongoing support of our customers that has enabled us to still be here and still offer programs like this one. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn things over to Davith to introduce our authors.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Well, we have a really special Northshire Live event for you this evening to celebrate the publication of Ramdas's memoir, Being Ramdas. We are very lucky to have with us Rameshwar Das. He is the co-author of tonight's book. Ramesh is a writer, a photographer, and the co-author of several Ramdas books, including Be Love Now, Polishing the Mirror, and of course, Being Ramdas. And joining him today is Mirabai Bush, the founder and director of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, who is also responsible for Google's Search Inside Yourself program. Like Ramesh, Mirabai is the co-author with Ramdas on 2 books, Compassion in Action and Walking Each Other Home. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Mirabai Bush and Ramesh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is really a nice treat to be here, especially since my son went to Skidmore, so I know Saratoga Springs a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
And Mirabai and I have known each other for quite a while.
50 years.
Yeah. We spent our youth in Asia, and now we're headed toward euthanasia. We were going to talk about dying tonight a little bit. I don't know if I can get away with jokes like that. I don't.
Corny jokes go well.
She knows them too well. So the Ramdas memoir was a project of about 10 years. And as many of you know or are familiar with his work, he had a stroke in 1997, early in 97. And he had, after that, one of the effects was severe aphasia. So he went, as Wavy Gravy said about him, he went from being the master of the one-liner to the master of the ocean liner. And so we worked slowly on it. And Mirabai's book, the most recent one, which was a conversation about dying called Walking Each Other Home, was also a very slow and deep conversation. And you know, because of his disability, I did a lot of typing right along with his speaking, even though I'm not the fastest typist who ever touched a keyboard by any stretch. But we managed a lot of back and forth over that time. And, you know, there are parts of the book that rehash other you know, accounts that he gave of major events, like meeting the guru or his first psilocybin trip. And we went into those in more detail and really thought about them and looked at them. And the view that we were approaching was seeing his life through the eyes of the guru. This guru, who Mirabai and I both went to see in India, was called Neem Karoli Baba, which was the name of a train station, and that's another story. But The guru for Ramdas was really an inner place of being, so that he used that view to look back on his life from kind of that inner soul place in himself, which he also thought of as Neem Karoli Baba, or Maharaji as he was commonly called. Mirabai, in the conversation that you had with him, was it sort of along that same line?
Yeah.
Talking from that Maharaji space?
Absolutely. Well, we made this commitment to each other at the beginning. Well, first we decided we were going to talk about dying, and then it was like, whoa, you know, we're going to be really careful with this. So we made the commitment that we would only. These are instructions Ramdas gave me 50 years ago when we were first leaving the monastery, all of us together. And I said, we've been in silence for months. I said, Ramdas, you know, I've been a student of literature and language. I said, how are we going to talk? I don't know what to say. And he said, it's easy. He said, say what you know. Don't say what you don't know. I said, oh, of course we were very serious then.
I wouldn't have had anything to say.
And that's what I said. I don't think I'll ever speak again. But so when we started this series on dying, a series of conversations between us, we said to each other, okay, let's just say what we know and not say what we don't know. And of course, around dying, you know, that's really important. So we didn't, you know, spend time talking about, we talked a little about what we thought happens after death, but we didn't spend a lot of time on that, not knowing that we didn't know. And just being honest about what we know and what we were still asking about. We finished just 1 year before he died. And so he was really out there and pretty, you know, ready. And there were also those long silences, but I loved that. I mean, you know, he'd stop in the middle of a phrase, you know, and then I'd be sitting there like you, like taking notes, or I used a recorder, but then be able to drop into this silence, you know, and just be there together. And we got to the place where it didn't matter what words he said, you know. So yeah, but it was a very unusual way to write a book, and even with him, which I had done years before, and he never stopped talking.
He had this big comfy chair because he couldn't move around very much toward the last couple of years of his life, that looked out over this expansive view of the ocean in Maui. And that was very much part of that kind of where his consciousness was in that later time. It was oceanic, for sure.
Yeah.
So and those silences were really...
like the ocean.
Yeah. Part
of it. And
he
did tell, I mean, he spent his whole life, career, you know, since, probably even including Harvard, but since then, using his own life as a teaching. So there's a way in which you would think that, well, everybody knows everything about Ramdas already, so why write a memoir, you know, or why even have a conversation about dying? He's just been talking about these things forever. I went back to Be Here Now, and there he talked about dying, and it was kind of all there already. But having lived a life after that, there's a different way in which you understand those stories that you've been using all these years. And that, so when I first read your draft and then than the finished memoir. You know, he talks about times in his life in here in ways that he didn't talk about before. They're not like radically different, but they're different enough so that me knowing everything about him, I thought, I loved reading it. I learned lots of things, and I just felt that it really came to life for me.
There was also, I mean, there was a way that we really kind of took off into other places a bit. Like there is part of near the end of the book where we were speculating about what it was like before he was born.
Yeah.
Not to speak of after death, but before birth. And I see Suryadas, who's got a newly adopted beard on his on
Is
the
he on
Zoom.
here?
And yeah, he is.
Oh, great.
And
I see Kate. Yeah.
And I remember, you know, he had some very useful commentary for Ramdas about the bardos and the ways of looking at a birth and between birth and death and birth. And you know, it was all imagination in one way, but because he was on that cusp, kind of toward the end, I think it feels kind of real, but how can we tell?
This is it.
You were particularly involved with him in service work, and that earlier book that you did was focused on service, and then you were very involved in the work for Seva Foundation.
Yes.
So I thought we ought to, especially since there is such need at this juncture in our crazed culture, cancel culture, whatever we're going to call it, for serving others, and where that came from in him and some of your experience with him and formulating that, because I don't know how many of you may know of Seva Foundation. It started out with people from the smallpox eradication program, and Larry Brilliant, who had been a devotee of Maharaji, had been sent by him to work in smallpox eradication. And here's this hippie doctor who ends up, first they won't talk to him, and then he ends up being second in command of the last holdout of smallpox in the world, in India and Bangladesh, which was the last place that it existed in the wild. And some of those people came together after everyone came back from India. Larry took another degree in public health and has become a real authority on epidemics, epidemiology. And they started a foundation in 1978, I think.
Something like that.
That was originally stood for Society for Epidemiology and Voluntary Assistance, or Seva, which in the Bhagavad Gita is the word for selfless service. So Larry was sort of into the medical side of that, along with some of the doctors, and other parts of the group were more into the selfless, working on yourself less part of it. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Mirabai, how that came to be, and just some of the adventures that you went on with Ramdas around that?
Yeah. Well, when we were with Maharaji, he didn't tell us much about what to do with the rest of our lives. And we, of course, wanted to know, what should we do? And pretty much he did tell Larry to end smallpox, which he ended up doing. But the rest of us, he said, love everyone. Oh, okay. Serve everyone, and always tell the truth. And so then he died in 1973. We thought he'd go on forever. And so then we had to figure out what to do with what he told us. And so Ramdas, who didn't have any experience with service. He'd grown up in a pretty privileged household in Newton, Massachusetts. His father had been a founder of I lost it. Brandeis University, yeah. and along with Einstein, and then Ramdas went on to Harvard and Stanford and Harvard. So he didn't really know what that meant to serve everyone, and of course he did a lot of service simply through teaching meditation and bringing yoga and all of what he did and writing Be Here Now. I mean, that served many people, but he still felt like he wanted to do like a more traditional service. And so when Larry and others started Seva, they invited Ramdas to be part of that team. And I was there a couple of years later. But and so Seva was doing very, most of the people in the beginning with Seva were yes, doctors and epidemiologists, and they were very used to hands-on service and looking toward how they could perform the most operations.
Yeah, it was
and
very
they had
results oriented.
Yeah, and they had in mind they were going to. We chose Nepal for various reasons, and then they chose to. The original goal was to eliminate unnecessary blindness in Nepal. It's a long story. It was a big, it was a big.
It was
goal.
fairly ambitious.
It was a big goal, and it was unreachable, really. Although Seva, to date, from that time, has brought sight to 5 million people. But in the beginning, we didn't know how to do it, and it was really difficult. So those of us on the board who were more focused on public health specifically were just wanted to get out and get as many operations as possible. And Ramdas's place was that unless we do it from a place of being open-hearted and compassionate and see it as a way to awaken ourselves while we are serving others, then it has no value. And
or we just get people more entrapped in their delusions or whatever.
So that became a central discussion. It actually, of course, had a lot of benefit because we all learned from each other during it. But Ramdas would get very frustrated during it. But he ended up getting very into it. I mean, he went to India and Nepal. He witnessed operations, and it was so moving to him that he was always looking for the way in which he could help. How can I help was another book he wrote. Mm-hmm. And he used to raise money for Seva. He'd go out. The thing he could do easily was go out and talk. And in those years, when we first came back, we put up a handwritten sign. We'd tack it to a telephone pole somewhere, and 1,000 people would show up for a talk from Ramdas. It was wild. And he'd just charge everybody $10, and then he'd get all this money, and then he'd immediately give it to Seva. One time he did a 90-city tour, staying in days inns everywhere, and just talking about service as a spiritual path. We called it the spirit of service, and raising money for Seva. So he he was amazing. His
I'm going to
his
read a
energy.
very brief passage from the book
Oh,
about
okay.
his service ethic, kind of. And keep in mind, I mean, he was named Ramdas by Neem Karoli Baba, and Das means servant. So he's carrying this name of servant of Ram, which is a form of God in India. So he's really was working that out for the rest of his life, as I think all of us have in terms of the, kind of Dharma names that came our way. It's, well, we're still figuring it out. I use social action as a vehicle to work on myself and offer my being for the relief of others' suffering. If I go to an anti-nuclear rally, it's an exercise of my own consciousness. When I work with a dying person, it is a manifestation of my own heart. Those actions keep feeding back to my awareness so that I become clearer, quieter, more present, more spacious. Gandhi said that any good you do in the marketplace will seem insignificant, but it's still very important that you do it. The less attached you are to your own desires, the more you can hear what other human beings need, and the less you project your own needs. Your response is more compassionate and appropriate to the need at hand. That doesn't mean you don't have desires. The paradoxical question is, how can we be fully engaged in life, yet not be attached? Translating the inner work on ourselves into action is a subtle art. I think that's a good encapsulation of some of what he struggled with and worked with and tried to model, through Seva and other projects that he took on, like the Dying Project. And there was the first one that he really undertook was something called the Prison Ashram Project, because there were all these, especially young people who were in jail for crazy long sentences for relatively minor drug offenses during the Great War on Drugs that Reagan and others promoted so efficiently, and gave us the highest prison population in the world. Thank you very much. But they put together ways to help people use their prison time as work on themselves. And I think that those aspects, that the Dying Project and the Prison Ashram Project and some of the work that he did with Seva have kind of receded in the the teachings that are considered maybe more spiritual. But that part of working, in such an existential, really deep way, and working on yourself at the same time is it's really a helpful way to see how you move in the world. Mirabai, I think there was that trip in Guatemala that you described, which I think we did describe in the book, that was so formative on his perception of what suffering and service can be about, especially in other cultures.
Yeah. We were working at the time with, it was right after the terrible violence in the 80s in Guatemala, where 400 Mayan villages have been burned to the ground by the army. We went there, and people had nothing, and yet they had this inner resilience that was extraordinary. And so I'd been working there for some time, and he came with me for a visit. And Ramdas had never been any place like that. He, I mean, been in India, but in India it was pretty protected. There were, I mean, the Indian families he knew were devotees of Maharaji, and he wasn't in any place where people were desperate. And so he just, I watched him just like tune into this real suffering and recognizing in the middle of it that people still, they'd lost everything and they still had a connection to something beyond themselves. It was just really clear. And he really loved that. And we also, on the way there, we went to a number of Mayan temples, and Ramdas just like opened up to all of that, his jaguar self. And we, it was really very moving. He always had these like
Sorry, I muted myself.
thing. My son was with us, and he was, I guess, a young teenager then. And we went to this village on the border of refugees, and so Ramdas is just getting to understand a little about Mayan people and what it means to have an earth-based spirituality, and he was really enamored. And then we went into the village, and the only place there was electricity was in this community center. It was like this really humble building with a cement floor. And but we went in there, and he'd kind of romanticized. And of course, still the women, the Guatemalan women, still, even as refugees, were wearing their hand woven traje, their traditional clothes, and they were really beautiful. So we went into this place, and we walked in, opened the door, and it was stunning because they were all clustered around a TV, and they were watching a Mexican telenovela, you know. Ramdas was horrified. He said, they're getting ruined by electricity. This is terrible. And you know, we spent some time there, and then we left and went off to wherever we're going. And Owen, who's a young teenager, he said he thought it was great that they had a TV. I mean, he said, look, if you'd lost your home and your, you know, and your elders and your husband and your land, wouldn't you want to watch TV? So they had that going for, I think, the rest of the trip. But he was wonderful there, really. And it was just another example of seeing the way in which he was able to always open to the moment, to what was happening, to the whole environment, to whoever was there, and how, of course, they responded beautifully. Yeah.
I think when you kind of look at the trajectory of his development through psychology and psychedelics and Maharaji, and then practicing all those years afterward in one way or another through service and spiritual practice and meditation and chanting and all of the pieces that he brought together. And then, you know, toward the last couple of years, he was just talking about loving awareness. And in the retreats in Maui, what came together, and I think what was so beautiful about those times, was this combination of wisdom and love, or Buddhist knowledge and compassion, this deep compassion that, and you could feel it in the room. I mean, Ramdas was like a radiating love.
Yep.
And that was what I felt around Maharaji also. And things got simpler and simpler and softer and softer. There was one incident that I remember with Mickey Lemley, who was the filmmaker who made the film Fierce Grace about Ramdas' recovery, a very difficult recovery after his stroke. And we were out at an Indian restaurant, and Ramdas said to Mickey, "I love everything." And Mickey looked at around at the restaurant. He said, "Everything? Do you love like the rug more than me?" And Ramdas said, "I love everything." And later, Mickey framed a piece of the rather stained rug from the restaurant and put it on Ramdas' wall for him.
Yeah. Yep.
So that was Maharaji's primary teaching also, which was sub-ek, which in Hindi is all one. And that, in that, being beyond thought and personality, it all comes together. And that was Ramdas being in the moment. And as he called it sometimes, burrowing into the moment.
Yeah. To talk about how he spent those last years in Maui when he thought he had lost everything, and then he slowly came back, to a certain place. But
we had gone to India with our kids in 2004, and he came with a small minibus load of students. I think he figured that if we could do it with our kids, who were 5 and 7 at the time, he could get there in his wheelchair. And otherwise, he had kind of given up on the idea that he could get back to India. But he did, and even though the ashram up in the hills where he stayed the first winter he was there was not what you would call handicap accessible. They made ramps for him, and they really tried to make it okay, and he did all right. When he got back to the States, though, he had this kind of 36-hour trip back across the Pacific to California with a stopover in, I don't know, Taipei or Singapore. And then he was home for a day, and he turned around, and he had scheduled doing running a retreat in Maui. And he did the retreat, but at the end of the retreat, he ended up with a high fever of like 103 or something, and they took him to the emergency room. And he had a urinary infection that had probably been kind of dormant in India or, background, and it had flared up, and it had turned into septicemia. He'd gone septic, and it had gotten into his bloodstream, and it almost took him out again. So he was in the hospital for a month in Maui, and again, barely made it, and was too weak to travel after that. And at that point was when he started living on Maui, mainly because he couldn't travel anymore. And he was also broke, because as Mirabai described, he gave away all of the money that he made lecturing and on books and other projects to charities or projects of one kind or another. So there was some friends stepped in to help. There was a teacher named Wayne Dyer who was kind of had done PBS specials and felt he owed a great debt of his understanding to Ramdas, and he raised a couple $100,000 for Ramdas through his network, and helped him get resettled on Maui. And we started running retreats on Maui and having people come to see him rather than him getting on the road. And in those latter years, we started doing online teaching that he could do. And one of the things that he really loved was he had a weekly, I guess it was Thursday afternoons, he would do what he called heart-to-heart individual Skype calls with people. And I think that was one of the things that he really enjoyed, was that really deep interaction with individuals, getting in there together until it kind of merged into that soul place, and they could both see what was going on from that inner place. It was what we talked about when we were working on the memoir ourselves, in a way, too. Mirabai, you held your conversations with him when you were doing the Walking Each Other Home book also. Sitting with him in Maui up in his bedroom. He had an upstairs bedroom that he got to by a lift that took him up the stairs in his wheelchair. And then he could sit and look at the ocean.
Did you ask me a question?
No, I was thinking about asking you a question, but I don't know quite how to phrase it. But how would you characterize that loving awareness combination that he was working with in those last years that became so kind of pervasive for everyone around him?
Well, he'd done a lot of Buddhist training, you know, and so he sat in Burma and
Goenka,
other places, and with Goenka, of course. And so he had a real appreciation for the Buddhist sense of awareness, of like this presence. What it was related to what he would talk about as the witness, but the awareness of seeing yourself as you are in the world, seeing the world, but not being identified with yourself or with externals. And then, of course, the message from Maharaji was always about opening your heart, being loving, being compassionate. Yeah. And Ramdas's experience of being with Maharaji, and mine, and I know yours too, was that we didn't do any practices or anything. We just sat there, and this experience of open-hearted love just was there. And so that was where Ramdas came in these last 10 or more years, in which he just wanted to rest in love. And as we know, it's hard to talk about, but this was really extraordinary. And so he would lead a practice for everyone, just simply saying to bring your attention to what you experience as your spiritual heart, and then breathing in and out, just saying over and over, I am loving awareness. And he'd say it over and over, and then toward the end, he'd just be saying, loving awareness, loving awareness. And because he you know, inhabited that space. It was very powerful for all of us being with him to be, you know, sharing that space together. It was, and in the last, well, most of, I'd say the last 10 years was certainly the last couple of years. He was just in that space all the time. You just walk into the room with him, and it was just amazing. I just feel like my whole body got like really kind of warm and awakened and happy, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember in the course of working together, at one point we were talking about that witness place. And I said, well, it's like that neutral observer that you use when you're doing Vipassana, right? And he said, no, it's from the soul. It's the connection to the soul. And that really took me in a deeper way. And he would sometimes, you know, gesture to his head and his heart moving down and show, you know, say or show people that he was moving from the mind to the heart. And he kept saying to people at the classes and otherwise, you're not who you think you are.
Mm-hmm.
You're not your thoughts. And that was the kind of boundary of that ocean shore that he had gone into. And he quite loved getting into the ocean physically and metaphysically every week. His favorite thing on Maui, I think, or one of them was Mondays were beach day. And he had this wheelchair with big balloon wheels that he could get down. They could push him down the beach and he could sit on the beach and then go right into the water. And he would wear like a life vest and just float and have, he would really be quite ecstatic.
Yes, yes. And, you know, I'm thinking that one of the reasons the book is so great is that if you just came upon him, as we're describing now, walking into the room and being flooded with love, you might not really be able to identify with that in terms of your own, you know, place in this life. But in the book, you really see, you know, how he grew up and how he struggled with all these, all the same things that everybody does, you know, what is the meaning
With
of life
his
and what am I
identity.
doing here? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the different stages he goes through as he, you know, as it becomes more and more clear. But he was learning and changing and growing, really. I mean, really, until he died.
I think when he died too, but that's something I don't know about.
Yeah. Yeah. So I loved that about the book, and being that you can read it, you don't have to read it all at once, but you can read from beginning to end and see the threads and how he worked with what he was given. You know, I used to, when he would tell his story, he would always, it would sort of be, especially in the early years, it would be, well, I was this person who became, you know, a Harvard professor, and I was all caught in my ego, and I didn't really have any wisdom. And then I took psychedelics, and then I went to India, and then I woke up. You know, that's totally under, you know, oversimplifying. But and then I met someone who had been his student at Harvard, And this guy was very smart himself. And he said, and he went to Harvard, and then he went to Columbia Law School, and he said, Ramdas was the best teacher I ever had. And it was somehow it just like was like, of course he was a good teacher. It wasn't like, he died as this one person and then began again when he took psilocybin. So the book does that for me too. Is, it creates this thread through his life that I think is helpful for everybody, because we all are trying to, follow our own threads, and we don't know where they're leading.
Well, that identity part was, he really started out in his psychological being, and he ended up being kind of a radiator of love, and that metamorphosis over that time. And when he first came back from India, he was talking about planes of consciousness.
Yeah.
But what I felt when I met him was this incredible love, and other people have said that also. And I think, that was Maharaji, or that place, the guru, that openness coming through. And when I got to India, that was what I felt. But it was coming through Ramdas, and he grew into it over those years.
Yes, yes. I said Krishna Das says he became the person that we always thought he was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This has been such a great event, but we've got a few questions in the audience, and we're running out of time.
Oh, great. Let's
so
take questions.
let me start. I've got one that got DM'd to me here.
Oh, yeah.
Just a minute.
Only 10 minutes.
Hold on, it's in here somewhere. This one is from Sarah. She says, what were some of the things you read or wrote in the book that you didn't already know about Ramdas's life?
Good question.
Well, there was a huge amount about his early life that I didn't know much about, including about the psychedelic work. And I that made his being make sense in a way that it hadn't entirely. I hadn't known the kind of totality of his experience in that lifetime. And it sort of, I could feel that, more of that trajectory feeling, because I met him when he first came back from India. So I met Ramdas. I didn't know Richard Alpert at all. And that was interesting. And I've still, kind of integrating that aspect of his psychology work and the psychedelic exploration and his spiritual teaching all those years.
There's another great question from Scott. He asks how this new book is different from other books about Ramdas.
Mirabai, what do you think about that? I don't know.
I think, as I was saying, what's great about it is it's called a memoir. It's really an autobiography. It's beginning to end, all the different times in Ramdas's life. And you can see how one leads to the other. And there's lots in there that, I couldn't believe there was so much in there that I didn't know after knowing him for 50 years.
Yeah.
So it's really fun. You will have, many of you will have heard many of his stories that are in here, but there's lots more detail in here, and also the way in which those stories fit in the greater picture of who he was.
I think that aspect of the way that he used his own experience, his humanity, to as his spiritual teaching, comes through more in this book, because there's so much of his experience.
Yeah.
There's a great and challenging question here from Jennifer. She says, how can we get to that place of love and stay there?
Ramesh.
Well,
You take the
my
easy
wife
ones.
is on this Zoom, so I know
I
I'm
see
going to
her.
catch it. She's going to give me shit no matter what I say. Well, there are I mean, what came from Maharaji is such an ideal, that sense that he really did love everyone. And when you sat around him, and that being, that place of being, which is in us, because we wouldn't feel it if it wasn't something that resonated in us, is something that we can continue to aspire to. And there are practices. This is what's called Bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. And sometimes you think of yoga as there's Hatha yoga and Gyan yoga, the yoga of the mind, and mantra, and all of these different practices. But they really, yoga means putting it all together. Yoga and yoke come from the same root, and it's that oneness, and it's what Maharaji referred to as it's all one. And I don't think that, we necessarily come to know that, or even identify with it. But if we continue to practice and clear and serve and allow ourselves to open, as Ramdas did, we get absorbed in it. There was a woman who took care of Maharaji in India, and she was called Siddhima, which was Siddha and Siddhi come from the same root, which is like perfect, so or perfected. But she had raised a family, and when her kids were grown and after her husband passed on, she came and lived at the ashram and took care of Maharaji. And after he died, after he left his body, she ran the place. And there was such devotion on her part and so much love that, and those of you who have encountered her or even seen her photo can get that. And this was someone who devoted herself to that place of love so much that she became absorbed in it. And I think that's what happens. I don't know much, I gotta say.
There's another question from Jennifer. She asks, what stories didn't make it into the book?
Well, I don't think that Jennifer, that was my acquisitions editor, knows very well, because the manuscript that we turned in was 187,000 words, which is about 3 books. Wow. And the final one was about 130,000 or 134,000 or something like that. And that's still a big book, as you feel when you pick it up. But there were a lot of little details that didn't maybe fit into the flow as well as might have. And at this point, I don't even remember what went in and went out. It's all kind of this, seamless kind of film of Maharaji and Ramdas. I mean, this interaction of these beings over a lifetime. I mean, as Mirabai said, 50 years is a big chunk of our lives, and to some extent, we've all inhabited this place together. So I can't quite tell what got left out, but there's still lots of stories.
And furthermore, it's a great idea for another book. It's Ramdas Stories Not Yet Told.
I'm sure someone will do that book, but it might not be me.
Thank you both so much. This has been a real delight. We are just about out of time, but I think there's one last question here from Mikey. He says, even though Ramdas has left his body, are there going to be any more Ramdas retreats?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, well, Mirabai is the president of the Love, Serve, Remember Foundation, and she can answer that.
Well, we are, we were going to have them right away. And then, of course, COVID came. So we are hoping to have one in November, December, which was the time of the annual retreat in 2021, this year. We'll see what happens in Hawaii. And then after that, there will probably be continuing to be retreats. And they may not be in Maui, maybe other places as well. But there is lots of information on ramdas.org, and there's just endless, we always would kid him that when he came back from India the first time, or when he did his first psychedelic, he started talking about it and he just never stopped. And so we really have like 50 years of Ramdas talking on video and on audio. And then of course he wrote 15 books or something. So there's lots of information on ramdas.org. And that's where you'll see the up-to-date information about retreats.
I will say that, these get-togethers on Maui took on a really quite special flavor. And it is that combination of love and wisdom, love and awareness, compassion and wisdom, service and devotion and detachment. All of those ingredients seem to flow together at those times. And I know that people who came, partly it was just to hang with Ramdas, but I think there is something that happens when people gather together in person, and it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Ramesh, Mirabai, thank you both so much. This has been a really great event. The book is Being Ramdas. You can order it from northshire.com. Rachel's putting the link up in the chat, and you can find it again at northshire.com. Thank you both so much.
Thanks so
you,
much.
everybody, and have a wonderful night.
Okay, good night.
Good to see lots of friends.
Yeah.
Saridas, I like the beard. Looks good.
Yeah. Kate, love you. Eddie.
Bye-bye.
Eddie, I love you. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye. Hi, Eddie.
Hi, Ramesh, Mira.
Hi, Aster. Oh.